Welcome on behalf of the Biodiversity Finance MOOC team to the first webinar of the Biodiversity Finance MOOC. This course is offered by the United Nations Development Program Biodiversity Finance Initiative in partnership with the UNDP Global Program on Nature for Development, the NBSAP Forum, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Financial support is provided by the governments of the European Union, Flanders, Norway, Germany, and Switzerland, and the Global Environment Facility. My name is Jameson Irvin, and I'll be your facilitator today. We're grateful for your participation in this first webinar entitled Introduction to Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, which will be presented by Midori Paxton, Ngawang Gyaltsen, and myself. A few words about our speakers. Midori Paxton is the UNDP Head of Ecosystem and Biodiversity based in New York. She's responsible for a large portfolio of biodiversity projects comprising about 320 projects in 130 countries and also the Biodiversity Finance Initiative. Midori has worked in Namibia between 2000 and 2010, where she worked under the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, focusing on strengthening the National Protected Area System. She holds a master's degree in environment and development from the University of Cambridge, and she's the author of 6 books and more than 100 published photos and articles. Welcome, Midori. And our third speaker will be Ngawang Gyaltsen. He is the National BIOFIN Coordinator for Bhutan. Ngawang crafted the first integrated methodology to the BIOFIN Climate and Policy and Environment and Institutional Review approach. Prior to joining UNDP, Ngawang worked for the Department of Forests and Park Services under the Royal Government of Bhutan. He's a forester by training and has over a decade of experience in Bhutan's natural resource management, protected areas, environmental policy development, conservation finance, and community-based projects. Ngawang studied forestry in India and holds master's degrees in mountain forestry from Boku University in Austria and in conservation leadership from Cambridge University in England. And my name is Jameson Irvin. I manage our Nature for Development program here at UNDP. I've worked in this field for about a quarter century, and I was the lead author on the first version of the BIOFIN workbook. Welcome, everyone, and let's get started. Before we begin with my presentation, I'd like to share some rules and dynamics for our webinar sessions, just to orient you. Microphones will be muted during the presentation, and this reduces interference and facilitates communication. The session will last about 90 minutes, and presentations will be followed by a question and answer session at the end. If you think of a question while the presentation is in progress, please go ahead and share it with us via the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll read your question during the Q&A session after the presentation. During the Q&A session, you'll have the option to categorize your contribution to the chat as a question or as a comment or observation simply by clicking on the appropriate icon for each contribution. If you want to speak and the connection allows for it, we will open your microphones during the Q&A session. And to let us know that you'd like to speak, simply raise your hand by clicking the hand button in the lower right-hand corner and selecting Raise Hand. And the chat window will remain open throughout the webinar if you would like to interact with us or other participants in the session. This Click Meeting interface will by default be displayed in English, but it's possible to change the entire web page to your preferred language at the top of the screen. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Learning for Nature YouTube channel, and all participants will receive an email when the recording is available. The presentation for today's webinar will also be available in the course room on Learning for Nature under the Week 1 tab shortly after the session. To kick off this session, I'd like to start my presentation. I want to start by looking back 100 years. The world 100 years ago was very different from today. The population was about 1.7 billion. Life expectancy was in the 40s. More than 60% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. And in the preceding 4 decades, more than 50 million people had died from famine. We've made incredible strides over the past 100 years, and even more so during the past 25 years. Global average life expectancy is now over 70. We've made more gains in life expectancy over the last 4 generations than we did over the last 8,000 generations. From 1990 to 2015, we were able to reduce the number of people in extreme poverty by half and lift more than 1 billion people out of poverty. Yes, we've made incredible strides in our lifetimes, but the gains of the 20th century have been largely at the expense to the environment, with grave consequences. Today we face unprecedented challenges in nature, climate, and human development. We know that rising greenhouse gases put us on track to a 3-degree future by 2100 or worse. Within the next 10 years, elephants may be extinct in the wild. Land degradation, depletion, and contamination occur in more than half of the Earth's land surface. Loss of forest cover and intactness, mangroves and peatlands drive climate change even faster. We're facing crises in water quality, contamination, and scarcity, affecting 2 out of 5 people around the globe. We're seeing natural disasters increasing in scale, and scope, and magnitude, and impact. We're seeing our global food systems becoming less diverse, less resilient, more at risk. There's a wholesale collapse of marine ecosystems, of reefs, of fisheries. Plastics and microplastic pollution threatens our air, our soil, our water, our oceans, and we're seeing an erosion of indigenous land rights. We're seeing poor governance, we're seeing inequality increasing. In addition to thinking about the environmental costs of development, we also have to ask about the social and economic costs. We must ask who has prospered and who hasn't. If the world were a village of 100 people, 11 would suffer from hunger and malnutrition, 10 would live in extreme poverty, 80 would live under $10 a day, and 50 under $5 a day. 21 would lack access to electricity, 10 would lack access to clean water, and 1 person would own more wealth than half the entire village combined. To tackle these challenges, the world agreed to an ambitious set of goals, the 2030 Agenda, or the Sustainable Development Goals. 2 of these goals focus on nature. Goal 14 focuses on marine pollution, coastal management, ocean acidification, fisheries, marine protection, subsidies, and other issues. This is life below water. And life on land, Goal 15 addresses conservation, restoration, protection, and sustainable use of terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, protection of threatened species, equitable benefit sharing, tackling of poaching, many other issues. But the Sustainable Development Goals also tackle a wide range of our societal aspirations, including eradicating extreme poverty, ending hunger, ensuring good health, providing quality education for everyone, promoting gender equality, providing clean water and sanitation, ensuring access to clean, affordable energy, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities, sustainable production and consumption, peace, and partnerships. These goals are built upon the earlier global agreement in 2010 in Nagoya for a global strategic plan on biodiversity. And this global plan for biodiversity includes 20 specific targets called the Aichi biodiversity targets because of the Aichi prefecture in Japan. And these targets cover a wide range of issues. The primary vehicle for implementing the Aichi targets and the global strategic plan are the NBSAP, National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. This is the primary instrument for implementing the CBD Convention. Nearly every country has completed its second round of NBSAPs. Despite this global commitment, these agreements that the whole world has made, and these specific biodiversity targets, we're losing the battle on biodiversity. We've lost 10% of wilderness in 20 years. We've lost more than 60% of more than 3,000 species in the last 40 years. We're losing up to 75% of insects around the world. By 2050, we'll have more plastic in the ocean than fish. And globally, fisheries are 90% are either fully overexploited or have collapsed altogether. And as I mentioned, we lose 20,000 elephants to poaching, 18 million hectares of rainforest to logging, and about 50,000 species every year. And our job is made more difficult by what's called the social, ecological, and economic doughnut. On the outer edge is our safe planetary boundaries. We've already passed 3 of these, and we're on track to pass even more. But at the same time, we must meet the needs of those who are in extreme poverty, and we must lower inequality. So this creates a kind of minimal operating space for us, and nature is essential for that safe operating space. Why do I say that? When you think about the 169 targets of the SDGs, nature is essential for at least half of them. We must learn to protect, manage, and restore nature if we're to at all have a hope of achieving our global aspirations and change our development trajectory. I'd like to give you 3 examples of how nature underpins the Sustainable Development Goals. And the first is forests. When we think about forests around the world, they sustain 1.6 billion livelihoods, mostly rural poor. We think about forests and water. 5.5 billion people around the world depend on forests for their drinking water. Without forests, we do not have a chance of having a glass of cold water to drink. Forests provide primary medicines for more than 4 billion people worldwide. And more critically, these days, forests absorb more than 1/3 of our greenhouse gases. We think about agriculture, especially agrobiodiversity. Agriculture sustains more than 1 billion livelihoods, again, mostly rural poor. It's the foundation of our food security, at least terrestrial-based food security. Agrobiodiversity in the form of agroforestry and silvicultural and diverse agricultural systems could improve the lives of 1 billion people who are undernourished or malnourished. And agriculture can provide climate mitigation and adaptation solutions. So that's the world as we are today. But what about if we look to 2050? When we look out ahead, we see population growth to as much as 10 billion people. We see food demand increasing somewhere between 40 and 45, even 50%, with an increased demand for meat, which drives deforestation. And we see a sharp increase in water demand. I want to take just one issue. We think about 2050 and the years ahead. If we look at intact forest landscapes, we can see high level of degradation in intact forest landscapes around the world just in the past 15 years. And we see that's projected to continue. But if we take a closer look, this is the Amazon. By 2050, we'll have 25 million kilometers of new roads. By 2030, we know that food demand will increase. We think about this forest estate that we have, the average patch size will decrease from 17 hectares, where it is today, to 1/4 hectare. And that means we'll be fast approaching critical climate tipping points. Once a forest is fragmented, it no longer sequesters carbon, but actually emits greenhouse gases. And climate change will be bearing down on us very hard. We know that. To wrap up, I want to put in your mind this image of a tugboat pulling an iceberg, and we're pulling and pulling in the one direction, saying, why are these NBSAPs not working? Why are these protected areas not working? And we're forgetting the subterranean currents underneath the ocean that are moving against us. And so I want to leave you with a couple of questions. And is the pace and scale of biodiversity efforts enough to turn the tide? And just a single fact helps illustrate this. The financial drivers of deforestation, subsidies and private investment capital, are 140 times greater than the financial drivers of forest protection and restoration. The loss of biodiversity and the degradation of our natural world is largely invisible in global and national media, outside of The Guardian, the New York Times, and a few other newspapers who regularly report on this with a few superstars like George Monbiot. But biodiversity coverage is only 3% of climate coverage. It is largely invisible. But more importantly, biodiversity is also invisible in our budgets, in our plans, in our policies, in the marketplace. So this course is about how to make biodiversity visible to those who hold power over the policy and finance decisions that affect biodiversity. This course is about tackling the drivers of biodiversity loss and identifying new finance solutions that can help reverse biodiversity loss and degradation and help move the iceberg the other direction. It's also about securing sustainable development and a future for billions of people around the world. With that, I thank you, and I'd like to now introduce Midori. I've read you a little bit about her background. Midori, welcome, and I'd like to turn the presentation over to you.
Invite you to the Biodiversity Finance MOOC flight to India. So we are shortly landing at the Ranthambore National Park, where we will be exploring how biodiversity conservation and sustainable development go hand in hand. I am a frequent visitor to the park and can guarantee a few surprises and, of course, close encounters with its most famous residents, the tigers. Before we start, let's start with some history. In the years when the Maharajas of Jaipur reigned, Ranthambore was a famous hunting reserve. With India's independence and the decline of the Maharajas, unregulated hunting surged. Ranthambore's tiger population declined to such a dramatic extent that before the onset of Project Tiger in 1973, there were only around 14 tigers left in the park. And since then, the population has rebounded, and at least 97 individual known tigers now exist within the park today. And it is arguably the most popular tiger reserve in India. I think you can see Jumru, the big male tiger. He is still thriving, living and thriving, and his splendid life at 16 years. 16 years is an impressive achievement in today's troubled tiger times and testifies to the excellent management of the area. I will never forget my first encounter with a tiger. It left me awed and breathless. A wonderful experience indeed. There are no fences in Ranthambore, and tigers are free to come and go. The 39,000 hectare park is surrounded by villages. This makes working with villagers critical for protection of tigers. Let me introduce you to the village wildlife volunteers. Backed by the Forest Department, this program is in full partnership with local communities. To keep their interest in the park and wildlife alive, and also to improve their livelihoods, the volunteers are given a monthly honorarium. It is now 5 years since the program started, and the results are very encouraging. The amount of information generated by village wildlife volunteers is phenomenal. These protectors of the region not only allow better monitoring of tiger population, but also lead to arrest of poachers linked to illegal wildlife trade. And village wildlife volunteers are far from a conventional community watch. They are trained in tracking wild animals and in the use of camera traps, smartphones for reporting, and most importantly, the actions required to be taken in case of any human-wildlife conflict incidents. And this is the neighborhood they watch. The beauty of Ranthambore is a rich mixture of culture, history, and nature. As the tiger population grew exponentially, so did annual tourism revenue in the whole area, park and surrounding communities. This win-win scenario clearly demonstrates that ecotourism can be a sustainable practice that can support financing for nature. The increased revenue can be used to tackle human-wildlife conflict and to improve management and protection of both tiger reserves and area adjacent and elsewhere in the country. Ranthambore Tiger Reserve is now totally self-sufficient, and part of the revenue is used to support other reserves. And when we look at the total flow benefits from Ranthambore, it is around $128 million per year. So this means for every $1 spent on management costs in the Tiger Reserve, benefits of $273 are realized within and outside the Tiger Reserve. And 5 most valuable ecosystem services, in addition to, of course, the cash generation, are gene pool protection, provisioning of water to neighboring regions, provisioning of habitats and refugia for a vast array of different wildlife, nutrient cycling, and carbon sequestration. So despite the immense economic values and why tigers are still disappearing across the range, the world has lost 96% of its tiger population from the estimated 100,000 in 1900 to around 4,000 today. The main causes of their disappearances are habitat loss, degradation, fragmentation, poverty and population pressure, and killing and poaching. And so why tigers are a critical animal for India? Tigers serve as flagship species. As their beauty, independence, size, strength, and even the allure of danger and fearsome reputation mark them out as something rather special in the animal kingdom. Therefore, they serve as a rallying point for people from all walks of life who are inspired to learn about nature and work to conserve the tiger, and by proxy, everything that shares the tiger's world. Tigers can be an icon for sustainable development. In fact, we have been advocating that a healthy tiger or any big cat's population should be an indicator for sustainable development. Protecting the tiger means protecting the entire ecosystem and its related ecosystem services, including flood prevention, provision of water, food, medicine, and tourism and cultural and spiritual benefits. So India is home to 70% of all tigers in the world. The tiger numbers is expected to cross 3,000 this year. That is up from 2,226 in 2015. This is a remarkable achievement for such a densely populated country. There are in total 50 tiger reserves in India, with 6 having been created in the last 5 years alone. This means 2% of India's geographical area now is managed for conservation. And according to the groundbreaking 2015 study, total value added of 6 selected tiger reserves to India's economy is estimated at 23 billion US dollars. For every dollar invested, $350 of ecosystem services are generated. If you look at the Corbett Tiger Reserve in the northern part of India, it provides drinking water to the city of New Delhi with 25 million inhabitants and irrigates about 600 hectares. So I'd like to end this journey with a quote from Prime Minister Modi of India. Friends, species belonging to the animal kingdom usually do not act to their disadvantage. However, human beings are an exception. I fully agree with him. Who, in the right mind, would not invest to get 350% return on investment? Who would want to lose the vital natural world which sustains our lives? And who would want to eliminate the wild and majestic tiger, a creature that is so deeply ingrained in our tradition and culture and in our psyche? So this story illustrates the importance of the 3 objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD: conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of utilization of genetic resources. I hope that you have enjoyed your visit to India. And now please sit back and relax as we shortly be departing for the rest of the MOOC. So I'd like to wish you a safe and pleasant journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Midori, for that excursion to India. And now I'd like to turn to a neighbor of India, and I'd like to call on Ngawan. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of insight from Bhutan and your experience with both BIOFIN and the Climate Expenditure Review, and really would love to hear about happiness. Ngawan, over to you.
Okay, so as Jamie mentioned, we are a neighbor, just few thousand miles from the beautiful Ranthambore. Thank you, Jamie. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. In the next 10 minutes or so, I will try contextualizing the role of biodiversity in sustainable development, and as Jamie mentioned, using some examples from Bhutan. Specifically, I've been asked to share how biodiversity criteria is used in the national development process and how this, in turn, incentivizes government to finance biodiversity, with examples from, of course, Bhutan's gross national happiness. I can go on talking on the details, but mindful of the time, I'll be very specific on example indicators and be as brief as possible, but also to let you all know, I'll have detailed session on biodiversity expenditures during week 4 of the MOOC. So looking forward to that. So to begin with, what is this Bhutan's happiness paradigm? As many of you are aware, hopefully, or at least some of you, Bhutan follows this gross national happiness, or GNH, as its development paradigm. By definition, GNH is a holistic and sustainable approach to development, which tries to balance material growth with non-material values, setting conditions for happiness. So in essence, it seeks out to balance development in all facets of life that are essential to sustain our happiness. This, according to GNH, can be achieved through balancing the 4 pillars, as you can see: equitable socio-economic development, preservation and promotion of culture, environmental conservation, all under the premise of good governance. And these 4 pillars are mutually inclusive and reinforcing each other. In this context, it's interesting to note from what Jamie has mentioned that GNH links very well to the challenges posed by what we call Anthropocene age today and the emerging challenges of climate change. And it recognizes today's issues of increasing consumerism, widening inequality, and instability, which is causing rapid biodiversity loss in our generation. There are 9 domains for the GNH, including ecology here, if you can see, which is linked to biodiversity. The 9 domains are further segregated into 22 variables, which I will discuss later. These variables are more for policy development, and 33 indicators, which are more for measuring happiness. Again, I'll touch on that later. Let me give you some examples. But before that, how these GNH pillars, variables, or indicators form the narrative for development and pursuing happiness in Bhutan. The GNH paradigm is indicators and tools, and on the other hand, these policies, programs, and resource allocations, they form this iterative and cyclic process informing one another. For the policy tool, there is a policy and a project screening tool, which I will explain later, which means that all policies needs to pass through this screening tool. As I said, I'll explain with an example, but doing so, this ensures that GNH is mainstreamed into new policies and plans here in Bhutan. This is also done to draw attention to the areas where government needs to address, therefore also use as some resource allocation formulas. Then there is this GNH survey that is carried out every few years to measure happiness, which in turn helps the government assess their progress and how they can actually sharpen policy interventions towards happiness. To explain a little bit more, GNH survey or the index measures happiness or well-being in a holistic way and looks at individual profile of happiness using these 33 indicators under 9 domains. And each of these 9 domains are actually given equal weights. These 9 domains are expected to contribute to individual happiness that is required. So in order to assess these happiness, some simple questions across these 9 domains are asked. For example, here on time, use, and balance, some simple questions like how much time do you spend on work, non-work, work-life balance, etc. And similarly, across all these domains, some simple to complex questions are asked to ascertain the value and the degree of happiness. The GNH screening tool, on the other hand, is measured, which it measures policies against 22 variables. And as I said, all these new policies have to undergo this screening tool to be approved. This is done to assess the impacts of policies on GNH or to select new policies which has opportunities for enhancing GNH values. Then the GNH domains are reflected in or guided within the 5-year planning process. So from the GNH survey that we have completed in 2005 recently, one question is, does nature or biodiversity make people happy? One of the questions asked was, do you agree that nature is the domain of spirits and deities? Overwhelmingly, about 84% of the population either strongly agree or agree to this answer, which demonstrate why is my slide moving now? So one of the questions, as I was saying, was asked whether nature makes Bhutanese people happy, and overwhelmingly 84% of the population strongly agrees or agree that nature is the domain of spirits and deities, to which this demonstrates the strong spiritual values that we have within the connection of nature that still exists in Bhutan, and also indicates high prevalence of pro-environmental benefits among pro-environmental beliefs among the population. Next question, how do you feel about conserving the natural environment? 79% of the Bhutanese population felt highly responsible. This is positive, isn't it? But no, GNH survey actually says this is a concern, as it is a drop from the past GNH survey in 2010. In 2010, when this question was asked, 83% of the population said they were highly responsible. So this 4% drop is a concern for GNH. So this is how detailed GNH survey goes. As I said, all these 9 domains are weighted equally. I think this is covered. But among these 9 domains, good health, community vitality, and ecology contribute to most of the GNH indexes in 2015. However, there's no much difference in the percentages, which means GNH in Bhutan is relatively well balanced across domains. So does it mean that nature may really make Buddhist people happy? Actually, not really. If you ask people what their biggest environmental issues are, over 42% of the population are affected by wildlife at the national level. And in the rural areas, it's more than 61%. Human-wildlife conflict is the single most conservation and a development issue here. 1 in 10 Bhutanese reported having their land fallow in the preceding year of the survey due to wildlife threats, which translates to almost 76,000 acres of land left fallow in a year. It's a serious concern for Bhutan, especially when the country has very low arable land and the cultivable agricultural land is only less than 3%. Going to the policy screening tool, let me give you an example of how this is used. As I mentioned, policies are screened for their perceived impacts or their opportunities for enhanced GNH values across 22 variables, which are linked to 9 domains of GNH. The score of 1 to 4, as it's shown here, is awarded depending upon the perceived impact of the policy on the variable. For example, there is a specific variable on biodiversity, which you can see here. And if there is a specific policy, it will be asked the question, whether it will have impact, like whether will it diminish the health of plant and animal diversity, and on the other hand, will it improve the health and the health of plant or animal diversity. Here, the score of 3 is set to be the threshold to be considered as favorably impacting the variables. So for a policy to pass the screening tool or considered GNH favorable, we require an aggregate score of 66, which is 3 times 22. 3 is the neutral score and 22 is the variables. Otherwise, the policy is either rejected or returned back for revisions. So as you can see, the ecology domain has 3 strong variables out of the 22. So it can easily fail in economic policy if it doesn't address its biodiversity concerns. Now let me move to the 5-year planning process. For the 12 5-year plan, which has just started its implementation, the 9 GNH domains were used to inform the 17 national key result areas, which are aligned also to the SDGs that Jamie mentioned earlier. And if you can see clearly, there are at least 3 direct key result areas at the national level speaking to biodiversity. Number 5 on maintaining healthy ecosystems, number 8 enhancing food and nutrition security, and number 17 on water. The budget allocation at the central level are mostly guided by these national key result areas, and at the local level, which manages almost 50% of the resources in the 12 5-year plan, GNH indices are used as a factor for resource allocations. For example, agriculture within the overall economy, 10%, and environment issues, specifically wildlife damage, 5%. Now moving to my final slide, and to conclude very briefly, as you have seen, for Bhutan, biodiversity is part of the environment pillar, which is essential to achieving happiness, and therefore strongly reflected in national planning processes and programs. The biodiversity agenda is also backed by strong political will and sound leadership, which has been borrowed from our monarchs and forefathers. But while this indicates positive financing in biodiversity sector, we still have financing gap in biodiversity. Even though there are conducive policies, strong political will, but biodiversity financing gaps still persist because of other competing sectors and other competing priorities necessary for government to sustain happiness. So if you look at this budget outlay for the current 12 plan, this is distributed across different sectors. And while biodiversity is important, you can see here that it is not necessary biodiversity receives larger share. Also, the GNH survey measures unhappiness. What are the biggest contributors to unhappiness, which in turn informs the government what they must do to increase GNH by addressing these so-called insufficiencies. If you look at this finding, which I'm afraid is not very clear on the screen, but what comes out strongly is the insufficiencies are in the areas such as housing, amount of time spent on work, schools, health. So in other words, more of social needs. So biodiversity may not necessarily strongly feature here. Coming to my, with this, I will come to the end of my presentation. And as I said earlier, I've tried to be as brief as possible, and hopefully I could simplify for some of you to understand. I'm not a GNH expert, but I have used their recent surveys and also some planning documents from the Gross National Happiness Commission, which is our planning commission. So you can see even our planning commission is known as Gross National Happiness Commission. I will be happy to answer questions, hopefully simple questions, or promise to get back if the questions are complex. But if you have other specific questions, I'll also be happy to answer, and look forward to week 4, where I'll be more technical and elaborate on biodiversity expenditures and CPIR processes, as Jamie mentioned. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Ngawang, and thank you again, Midori. So we've heard about an overview of the state of nature and the state of sustainable development and how nature underpins development. We visited a park in India and saw why tigers are extremely valuable for development, something that we must invest in, and something that also moves us personally. And then we've had a tour of the architecture of Bhutan's national growth, domestic national growth happiness framework. I'd like to open up the floor with a few questions, but before I do, I saw one question in particular that we've already started to tackle, and that was with, I think it was Rod, who asked about the question of why isn't population being tackled? So what I'd like to do is just share my own response, and then let's open it up while a few people are still typing their questions. So the issue here is that, yes, population is the underlying driver, but it's not just population on its own. It's how we consume and produce the materials that we need to feed ourselves, to clothe, to transport, to do all the things that humans do. It simply is unsustainable. The planet could even support more people, and we could still restore the planet within those planetary boundaries. But what we really need to focus on in this juncture in time, in addition to women's reproductive rights and access to healthcare and reproductive choice, is sustainable consumption and production. And just to give one example, when we think about our diets, beef is responsible for half of all deforestation worldwide, and just 4 commodities, beef, soy, palm oil, and timber, is responsible for about 80% of deforestation. So we really need to rethink everything right from our plate on. So let's move on to some other questions. And the question was, what are the 3 planetary boundaries that we passed already? This is from Jesus. And the 3 planetary boundaries that we've passed already include genetic diversity, phosphorus, and nitrogen. And I've shared a link of the source, some of the definitive sources for planetary boundaries that Johan Rockström has raised. I see we have another question. This is, let's see. This is from James. Really interesting question. Thanks for helping raise the profile. I was wondering what the perspectives are on yesterday's announcement, the Bank of England and Banque de France, that the global financial system faces an existential threat from climate change, a sign of tangible change or just more hot air. Great question, James. And if Midori and Ngawang permit me, I'd like to take a first stab at this, and then feel free to chime in. We're witnessing a sea change in investor risk awareness with not only climate change, but also with biodiversity loss. And we see statements that came out, for example, in September of last year, where some 30+ investors worth more than $3 trillion in assets committed to not investing in companies that are contributing to deforestation in the Amazon. We're seeing sea shifts in investors seeing what they're doing, what they're investing in as a liability. And it will take time for that to trickle into national investment schemes, into private sector finance. But it is, I think, a bit more than hot air. We're seeing tangible commitments from investors. And one of them, for example, is the New York Declaration on Forests. And I'll be happy to put a link in the Q&A mode where some dozen investors have committed to deforestation-free commodities. Let's take the next question. Unless Midori or Ngawan, did you want to add anything to that? If not, I'd like to go over to Ritesh Raj Srivastava's question. What is the scope of sustainable development in other parts of India for biodiversity conservation with empowered livelihoods for the people living in the conflicting zone? Example, Upper Himalayan region. Great question. The floor is open for Midori and or Ngawang.
I just want to say a few words on the previous question. That's when I was trying to talk. I think that statement really underscores the importance of shifting flow of finance investment in the world, because biodiversity financing is not really only about how we generate new financing, but how we can redirect current investment, current financing flow so that it doesn't drive environmental degradation, destruction. So I think it's very significant, and we are trying to work in this field as UNDP as well to engage with financing institutions and financial regulators to come up with ways to ensure that global investment is more towards nurturing nature rather than destroying nature. And so, yeah, I'll read this question, but maybe I can ask Gawan to say a few words if you'd like.
Ngawang, the floor is yours, being a resident expert in this region.
Yeah, I think I'm audible now. From the experiences of Bhutan, also part of the Himalayan region, what I can say is based on all the context set by Jamie on the intricate rules of forest and agriculture in sustainable development, there's this huge opportunity. The Himalayan region is also a biodiversity hotspot, which means it has high proportion of endemic species, but at the same time, the degradation of original habitats is huge, and especially the relation with the ecosystem services that Midori mentioned. Especially in the mountain livelihoods, biodiversity is the natural capital of the poor. So all the policies and all should gear towards people-centric approaches. And from BIOFIN's perspective, that's what we are trying to look at, how we can bring the finance argument to connecting people with nature. So I can see huge opportunities, but more importantly, more of learning from each other within the local concepts of traditional biodiversity management as well as science.
Great. Thank you, Ngawan. This next question comes from Caitlin, who says, hello, everyone. I'm curious. We've heard a lot in the presentations about the economic benefits of biodiversity. How does this financing approach compare to a rights-based approach to biodiversity? And what does this difference mean in terms of programming design? So I had responded a couple of thoughts, and I'd love to hear from some of the participants if they have thoughts as well and their experience with rights-based approaches. But we are witnessing a revolution in how we make legal cases around biodiversity loss and climate change. And I put two small links in the queue in the public discussion mode. And these are, for example, youth-based lawsuits focusing on climate change and pollution that focuses on rights-based approaches for the right to human health, the right to clean air. But it does take time, and this is not yet filtered into, for the most part, national schemes for biodiversity planning, looking at rights. If it did, we would probably begin to see at least two types of changes. We would see a difference in the time frame in which we make decisions. Right now, these are 5-year plans. We might begin to see much longer time horizons that account for the rights of those who are not yet born or who children are today, and also whom we involve in our participatory processes. And this is a key aspect in the BIOFIN learning journey, is thinking about who are we involving in throughout the BIOFIN process, who needs to be involved that might benefit from or be dependent upon biodiversity, who isn't usually involved in these processes.
Jamie, meanwhile, maybe I can attempt to
Please
just
do.
give a viewpoint. Yeah, this is a great question, and I think as we go to the financing solutions of BIOFIN, we must definitely try to address these through what we call financial safeguards. But just to give an example, as Midori mentioned, the third objective of CBD is access and benefit sharing, fair and equitable benefits to those, so which is the right space. And to give you an example of ecotourism, yeah, I think so. Ritesh is online. So yeah, over to you, Ritesh. Yeah.
This next question comes from Sylvia. And Sylvia, you write, it may be easy to funnel a finance pipeline around an iconic species such as the tiger, but what about less nice species such as xylophagus beetles or even less apparent biodiversity components as the microbiomes for microbial creatures yielding essentially yet invisible ecosystem services? Great question. Midori, is this something you'd like to tackle?
And again, going back to the previous one, the light-based approach, I think goes hand in hand with all sorts of biodiversity finance actions on the ground. I think, as Naran explained, when it comes to ABS or ecotourism, obviously the communities, especially in the rural areas, will be at the center of our actions. And so our projects and programs are definitely following the human rights approach. And I'd like to also remind ourselves that there was UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights report, I think it was 2016, about biodiversity conservation and human rights. So basically, having endowed the biodiversity is really underpinning human rights as well. So it's good to recognize. And for this, yes, obviously they're all small creatures, including bacteria and all that, are critical for the ecosystem services. And so iconic species are often used as, again, like as a flagship. Obviously we are not to say that we only save those charismatic species, elephants and tigers and so on, but we are really using them as a flagship for the ecosystem they represent, which includes all the small players.
Thank you, Midori. We have a couple of questions now, and I'm just going to see here. Is there any permanent solution to poaching? Ultimately, we talked about Ranthambore National Park, but threats like poaching have been mentioned. Is there an ultimate end to this inhumane killing? It's a great question, Vibhuti. I'm wondering if this is a difficult question to answer. We know that consumption for illegal wildlife continues to grow and the demand continues to grow. Would anyone like to respond to this issue in particular? How do we end poaching and what are some finance solutions we might consider?
Can you hear me?
Midori, please. Yeah, please.
Yeah, great. So yes, what will become solution? Obviously, there are different solutions which we can come up with at different parts of the illegal wildlife. Of course, eliminating demand is one, but on the supply side, where wildlife comes from, ultimately, I think to stop poaching, people on the ground, people who live side by side with the wildlife, has to start seeing the benefit. It doesn't have to be, monetary benefit necessarily, but they have to see the value and benefit of living within that wildlife-rich area. So for working with community like I described with village community volunteers is critical. And I have a quick nice story from Namibia where I used to work. There are lots of community-based conservation activities in Namibia, and poaching, although now it's getting a problem, stopped and wildlife really recovered immensely when people gained the right to benefit from wildlife. So people stopped seeing wildlife as government animals causing nuisance to their lives when they realized that they own their land and wildlife is their asset, which they can use for tourism and other activities and can benefit from. So that shift in the system and the perception has to be made, I think, at the local level from supply side of wildlife products, illegal, which goes into illegal wildlife trade.
Thanks. Let's go to some new questions. This is a question from Pierre saying, what is the difference between biodiversity status and biodiversity trends? Thanks for the question. And the difference is that biodiversity status is a snapshot in time. What does biodiversity status look like right now? But that is never the same, never a whole picture. It's a little bit like your financial statement if you're a small business. You want to know, yes, how much do you have in the bank right now? What is your profit and loss? But you want to know how is that changing in time, because that gives you an indicator of what you need to do. So biodiversity status, for example, on forest cover tells us about the world. But biodiversity trends tells us which direction we're headed in and how we need, where and how we need to take action. It's a critical difference, and one that many countries in their NBSAPs that you may have started reading really don't address. They're great at status, but looking at trends over time, not so much. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are the biodiversity status and trends in your country, and what do we need to do to tackle them. Let's take a question from Facebook Live, a question from Elena. What are some of the mechanisms to motivate governments committed to protect biodiversity to include biodiversity integration policies in the national development plans? So there are a number of mechanisms that could motivate governments to protect biodiversity, and some of these include payments for ecosystem services or other forms that help link the biodiversity benefits to finance mechanisms that help preserve ecosystems. Many national development plans around the world don't have biodiversity in them. And we can just give one example from a country where we worked recently, and we saw that the loss of wetlands and fires around their capital were having a huge impact in their water security, but wetland conservation didn't even factor in their national water plan. So now when I see you're online, maybe you could take a stab at helping answer this question. What are some of the mechanisms that might help governments see the value in protecting biodiversity and integrating that into national development plans?
The approach that we take from BIOFIN's angle is to build a business case of protecting biodiversity. On one hand, the business case is how the values of nature can be unlocked, right? As Jamie mentioned, in the form of payment in the form of ecosystem services, in the form of valuation, as Midori mentioned, giving very clear numbers to the government. But on the other hand, the stronger argument, especially in biodiversity-rich areas, are to communicate what are the consequences of inaction to biodiversity conservation. What if we don't conserve biodiversity? What are the consequences that, there are two ways to build the business case. One is to make government aware of the value of nature and the natural capital, and the other way is to inform the consequences of inaction. So as Midori told the story of what if we protect and what if we don't protect the tiger, what are the consequences? So through BIOFIN, we try to build that narrative around the business case, and I think we'll be happy to share some of the lessons. And also within the NBSAP, as Jamie mentioned, there are some tools how we can mainstream and integrate biodiversity actions specifically across the government plans and programs.
Terrific. And while we have you on, we have a follow-on question. And this is from Maha on Facebook. How do you establish the business case to the board of directors on financing biodiversity, and how do you show financial return? What kinds of collaboration should happen with the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Happiness in your case being the direct stakeholder and owner from a governmental perspective. Midori, is this something you might like to speak about?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Again, for this one and for the last question, I think BIOFIN as a project, BIOFIN approach is very unique because within the government, if you are just engaging with Ministry of Environment, talking about the importance of biodiversity and intact environment, that often does not go very far because it's for the ministry to then motivate to the rest of the, the government house. But BIOFIN is really directly engaging with Ministry of Finances in countries and also national development agencies. And as many of you know, they are the strong agency within the government. So bringing this whole biodiversity financing issues in the heart, financial center of the government, that's been very effective and has been the important strategy in terms of making sure that the government realizes the importance of it. And then, we look at the financial, financing plan and different financing mechanism. And some part of that would be looking at the sort of negative financing public expenditure might be making, like in some cases, agricultural subsidy might be actually detrimental to biodiversity. And so again, if Ministry of Finance in the driving seat, it's actually for them to save money by changing the practice, perhaps reducing and eliminating the subsidy and rather invest that money into actions and programs which will conserve biodiversity. And we have also a tool called target scenario analysis, which looks at sector, looks at a particular sector, whether it's livestock sector, fishery, whatever economic sectors, and then it looks at how business as usual scenario of that sector, how the growth may be into the future, and compare that with how it looks like in the long term if the biodiversity and other environmental concerns are integrated in that sector planning and practices. So this is one of the tools also we use in terms of making the case for biodiversity conservation and to show from sector perspective how conserving biodiversity, doing business conserving biodiversity is ultimately good for the sector, more beneficial, more profitable for the sector. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you,
Jimmy, I
Midori.
just came. Yeah, I
Yes,
just
great.
got online. But as Midori mentioned, we have through the BIOFIN process learned to speak the finance language through environment perspectives and vice versa. But just to add on, the BIOFIN process and our business case is not only to demonstrate financial returns. We have other financial solutions, meaning we have 4 different categories of financial solutions. One is definitely on demonstrating financial returns, which we call generating revenues. The other ones are more of delivering better. So to help the government, how they can deliver effectively, efficiently. And also there are some other opportunities of realigning expenditures within the current financial system in the government. One of the strong languages that we also use to build the business case is how do we avoid future costs? So here we give examples of, for example, biosafety or climate change. And getting back to my earlier point of clearly explaining to the government of consequences of inaction. So for example, if you don't invest in particular species conservation or climate change today, it may cost you 100-folds in 10 years. So these are some of the business cases that we build. So long story short, financial returns are not the only solutions we are looking at. We are also looking at other suites of financing solutions.
Now, I think you faded out. If I could request, it would be great if you could type your answer into the chat box. We'll be sure to capture it and we'll publish it online as part of capturing the lessons I'd like to turn to the final question, and this is from Mark on Facebook. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but we will online. We just wanted to give just a few moments to wrap up. So Mark from Facebook asked, one point was the poor coverage of biodiversity and climate change issues in the media. Without this, public interest would remain low, and political will to solve ecological problems will be low as well. Media houses are businesses, and funding for environmental related reporting is vital. Increase ideas on how to increase this. I'd like to respond to this to say that I've been overwhelmed by the Greta Thunberg phenomenon. If you haven't heard of her, then Google Greta Thunberg and you'll see a remarkable previous 15-year-old, now 16-year-old, who's making the earth shake in terms of climate action. She's fostered climate strikes, and these have been reported on. We see that climate coverage is starting to hit the media, and it's starting to hit weather channels, and it's starting to hit news reports in all different formats. Biodiversity is the hidden stepchild of climate change in terms of forces that are affecting our world. It only receives 3% of the coverage of climate change, and nature-based solutions for climate change, such as forest restoration and regenerative agriculture, only receive about 2% of climate mitigation finance. So this needs to change, and BIOFIN is a process of unveiling the value of nature, of understanding it, unveiling the drivers of biodiversity loss and degradation and change, and tackling those drivers through a look at the institutions and the policies behind them. Our goal is to make the value of biodiversity visible, whether it's through reporting and through analysis, through media, and then to increase the finance solutions for biodiversity finance. But with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd like to thank the participants of the session. You'll be able to download today's presentation directly from the course room under the Week 1 tab. I'd encourage you to visit our website, learningfornature.org, to get the latest news regarding this webinar and, of course, the Biodiversity Finance MOOC. We invite you to share your thoughts regarding this webinar on the webinar page in the course room, and we look forward to your feedback and continued questions. We really look forward to sharing your questions with the broader BIOFIN resource team, and our facilitators will be happy to direct those questions to them. If you know of anyone who'd like to enroll in this course, there's still plenty of time. We have 7 weeks to go, and we'd encourage you to send them a registration link. We want to make this as broadly available as possible. And I want to issue a personal invitation to everybody on this call to find a learning buddy. Find someone on the site, get to know them, you can connect with them, and learn with them. Share thoughts, share your homework, share your discussion thoughts, and find someone from your country or someone not from your country. And finally, I'd like to say I hope to see you next Wednesday, 24th of April, at the same time, for the second series of webinars in the Biodiversity Finance webinar series. Thank you so much, everyone.